Hello and welcome to this episode of MacroSutra. I'm TCA Sharad Raghavan, and now we know the Delhi elections are done. We know that the BJP won with quite a strong margin. But what we also know is that in the run up to the elections, every single party running the race promised all kinds of freebies. Now the BJP has won, and so it has to come through on the promises that it made. Can Delhi's finances hold out against all of these freebies? What do the finances look like? To discuss all of that, we have with you Radhika Pandey, Associate Professor at NIPFB. Thank you so much, Radhika, for joining
Thank
us.
you, Sharad.
So now, Radhika, looking at Delhi's finances, let's first analyze the revenue and expenditure position, largely the revenue deficit. Historically, Delhi has been a revenue surplus state, which is
Correct.
quite an unusual position for any
Right.
Indian state to be in.
Right.
But is that now changing?
Yeah, so that's true. Delhi has had a revenue surplus since its reconstitution of Legislative Assembly in 1993. It has had a revenue surplus and quite a substantial revenue surplus if we consider in terms of share of GSDP.
Right.
More than 1%. So that's quite substantial, and that's quite a very unreasonable for Indian state, as you pointed
Right.
out, very extraordinary. But also on the fiscal side, also there were a few years pre-COVID where Delhi also had a fiscal surplus. So it's not just revenue surplus, but also fiscal surplus from 2014-15 till 2018-19. Leaving aside 1 year, 2016-17, Delhi also had fiscal surplus, and even now, even though now Delhi is in fiscal deficit, in terms of magnitude of fiscal deficit, it has been rising, particularly in the last 2-3 years after COVID. But again, when measured in terms of the percentage of GSDP, it is still reasonable at 0.7.
Okay.
Compare and contrast with states like Punjab and other states that we've discussed where it's above 4% or even above 5%. Delhi's fiscal deficit as a share of GSDP is 0.7% as of 23-24. Notably, we do not have the GSDP numbers for Delhi for 24-25. This is something that should have been out by the official document, but it is not.
Right.
So most of the numbers that we talk about will be till FY24. And if when we talk about FY25, we'll talk in absolute levels, and we will assume a nominal GDP growth of 9 to 10%,
Okay.
which is reasonable considering the country's nominal GDP growth. And we'll talk about the numbers. So in essence, revenue surplus has been there. Now, if we look at the revenue surplus over the last 2-3 years, this surplus has been shrinking. So that is something to take note of, that in 22-23, the revenue surplus was as high as 14,000 crore.
Right.
And for the current year, which is FY25, it is budgeted at 3,231 crore, which is also not going to be met. And in all probabilities, as per the Finance Department of Delhi's own projection, Delhi is going to slip into a revenue deficit this year itself. Even without taking into consideration the additional electoral promises that will come into force,
Right.
even considering the AAP government's revenue and expenditure pattern, we will see that in all likelihood, Delhi will slip into revenue deficit in the current year.
Right. And just to clarify, when we say revenue deficit, that basically means when your revenue expenditure is more than your revenue receipts, which means that what you're spending on your day-to-day operations is more than what you're earning from your day-to-day operations. This doesn't take into account the capital receipts and the capital expenditure. This is just your day-to-day income and expenditure. And it looks like Delhi is now moving to a situation where its day-to-day expenditure is more than its day-to-day income.
Great.
So, what then is leading to this? Let's look at it first from the revenue side and then expenditure.
Right.
So, on the revenue side, what is happening? Is revenue slowing?
Yeah, so that is very notable because let's first look at the profile of Delhi's revenue.
Right.
For any state, we know that revenue comprises of tax revenue, non-tax revenue, and the grants and transfers from the central government. Now, in case of Delhi, the recommendations of the 15th Finance Commission are not applicable. So, a fixed amount is paid by the central government to Delhi in lieu of the 15th Finance Commission recommendation. But in addition, addition, Delhi gets some transfers for running the centrally sponsored schemes for disaster management, and then there are certain more heads. So if we look at the Delhi's revenue profile, we'll see that own tax revenue of Delhi accounts for more than 90% of the overall revenue receipts. So it's basically it's not a region, a state, or a UT that is depending so much on the central government.
Right.
It has its own sources of revenue generation. So own tax revenue accounts for 91% of the overall revenue receipts, and within that also there are state GST accounts for roughly 60% of the own tax revenue. So this is just a basic profile. And from 2017-18, when GST was introduced, we have seen that GST revenues have almost doubled until 23, 24, 24, 25. So we've seen that state GST collections have increased. But what is of concern is that state's own tax revenue, Delhi's own tax revenue as a share of GSDP is declining. From 2014-15 till 23-24, we have seen that there is a secular decline in the share of states' own tax revenue to GSDP. It used to be around more than 5%. It used to be around 5.4%, and now it's down to almost 4.8%. Till FY24. So this is in contrast to, if we look at the, in general, if we look at the all India states average, where we are seeing that gradually the OTR, the own tax revenue as a share of GSDP has been increasing. But Delhi has been an outlier in the sense that Delhi's own tax revenue as a share of GSDP has been sliding over the last couple of years from 2014-15. And also in terms of the year-on-year growth, when we talk about the growth over the previous year, there also we see that particularly in the last 3 years, the tax revenues have been, the rate of growth of tax revenues have been declining. So it was 18% in 22-23, but the last 2 years, the rate of growth of tax revenues have been declining. So that's the challenge from the revenue front.
So now, is this due to the customs duty or excise or any of those taxes? Because as you said, if SGST, the state GST, that's been doing well, then some of the other taxes must be suffering?
Correct. So the other taxes are not rising at a very sharp pace. Like we have property tax, we have the other excise duty collection. They are rising, but they are not rising at a very sharp pace and in comparison to the size of the economy, which is measured in terms of GSDP. And therefore, we are seeing that there is a decline of own tax revenue as a share of GSDP. And even when we talk about GST collections, we see that if you look at the trajectory, in the initial years, the rate of growth was much faster. Now it's plateauing. And going forward, again, it's a reflection of the overall state of the economy as such. And going forward, when we are talking in terms of, rationalization of GST collections to prop up demand, it's highly unlikely that we will see a significant spurt in GST collection. So that is something that, there is going to be some level of decline in the buoyancy of tax revenues going forward. And that's going to be a challenge in an environment where there is the scope and coverage of freebies and subsidies have increased significantly.
Right. And that's exactly what we're going to come to next. What is the pressure on the expenditure side that they're facing?
Absolutely. So while the revenue side is doing reasonably okay, there's no significant pressure. It's not seeing a very significant increase, but it's more or less fine. But the problem lies on the expenditure side, where we are seeing that in particular, the revenue expenditure is increasing at a sharp pace. Particularly in 2023-24, revenue expenditure increased by 17% over the previous year. And even for FY25, revenue expenditure is expected to increase by 8%. And that is again driven by committed expenditure plus subsidies. So it's the salaries, pension component, as well as the subsidy component, which is increasing the outlay on revenue expenditure. And in contrast, we are seeing that capital expenditure has been declining. In fact, Delhi is one of the states which has seen considerable underspending, more underspending, more than average underspending on capex outlay. Delhi has seen over the last 2-3 years in particular, and we've seen that every year the outlay on capital expenditure is being reduced, and for the latest year it's only somewhere around rupees 5,000 crore, which is not even making up to 1% of GSDP. For a state like, for a capital city, if we are not even spending 1% of GSDP on capital expenditure, that is a disappointment. That's a problem.
Absolutely. And I mean, even if you're saying that, okay, we aren't going to build new roads and there's no more space for new roads,
for maintenance,
for maintenance and upgradation, and just for each time it rains, you need to fix the road again.
So that's
you need to spend on that.
Right. So that is what we are seeing. That is the biggest casualty of this, so much allocation towards revenue expenditure, that if we look at the overall capital expenditure, it is declining, and the amount that is being budgeted is declining, and the amount that is again announced as a revised estimate is much lower than the budgeted estimate. In fact, for FY25 the amount is 35% lower than the revised estimate of FY24.
Right.
So that's the sharp pace in which the capex is declining because of the increase in revenue expenditure, and within revenue expenditure it is primarily the subsidies. Even for the even if we just look at the, if we do a search for the word subsidy in the FY25 Delhi budget and just count those items, it's almost adding to 8 to 9,000 crore.
Wow.
So that's just and that's not the entire coverage of freebies and subsidies. So even if we look at that, so that's the problem, that it's the revenue expenditure which is occupying the major chunk, and within revenue expenditure, the amount of outlay on subsidies is rising at a very sharp rate, and therefore capex outlay is suffering.
So now, okay, we do have a general idea of the trouble that faces the BJP government, but in a nutshell, what would be their core challenge in managing Delhi's finances now going ahead?
So because now they are going to inherit an economy which is going to be slipping into a revenue deficit. And at the same time, the BJP government has also promised a whole host of measures, subsidies, and the coverage is even more than what was promised by the AAP government. In terms of, some of the main promises were the cash transfers to women, where AAP had initially in its budget, they had promised rupees 1,000 per month to women of lower income families. In the budget, they increased it to rupees 2,100, and BJP went one step ahead, promised rupees 2,500. Now, and plus 21,000 for pregnant women. Now, if we assume that, that's a ballpark number, 38 lakh eligible women in Delhi. Now, this alone is amounting to more than 11,000 crore. So this is the additional expenditure over and above what is already there. So the BJP government has said that they are not going to stop the existing welfare schemes, freebies of the previous government, and they are going to announce additional ones on those. One is in particular this. The other is the Ayushman health scheme, which was not implemented by Delhi, and the scope and coverage of that scheme has also been enhanced to cover 70 plus citizens. So therefore, there would be additional expenditure there also. There's going to be pension scheme for senior citizens. There's going to be additional expenditure. So in a nutshell, if we just count some major items of spending from the election manifesto of BJP, we can see that there's going to be, a very conservative estimate, somewhere going to be between 13 to 14,000 crore additional spending. That is sure to take Delhi into a revenue deficit. as well as fiscal deficit. So now the challenge is how to maintain the fiscal prudence. That would require augmentation of revenues, that would require debt management, because if we what we saw in the month of November was that the AAP government sought rupees 10,000 crore as loans from the National Small Savings Fund to meet its growing expenditure. Now, we need to see whether this is a very prudent move, because borrowing from NSSF is very costly. It's an administered interest rate scheme. Prudent debt management policies, augmentation of revenue, more focused subsidies, all these will be needed to ensure that Delhi does not deviate too much from its fiscal prudent roadmap.
Right, and the fact that the elections just happened should be a positive thing, because now you don't need to try to bribe voters for another 5 years. You're here, you're in power. Over the next few years, you can actually start consolidating your fiscal situation. But now, Radhika, we have a few questions from the audience. One is from Siddharth. He asks, given the expenditures around the cleanup of the Yamuna and also populist schemes, does the new state government need to revamp the liquor policy for higher excise duty collections?
Now, in general, what we need to see is that Delhi needs higher revenues. There is no
Right.
doubt. That is what we have seen, that because of the substantial increase in subsidy allocations, as well as due to the sipping into a revenue deficit and fiscal deficit situation and higher borrowing requirement, Delhi needs significantly higher revenues. Now, how those revenues will be streamlined, how they will be augmented, that is something that the government needs to consider. Now, as regards the liquor policy, there is a recent CAG report which says that there is a loss of more than 2,000 crore to the exchequer due to the previous government's policy. So, all these things need to be taken into account to ensure that there is a substantial increase in the revenue collections from the various tax heads. So a fresh look at the various heads of revenues would need to be done, because now that is the only way to go forward and to have some kind of prudence in the fiscal path going forward, given that expenditure commitments are not likely to be rolled back.
I mean, of course, they could break their promises,
Yes.
but then
Yeah.
that doesn't look good for
That
any
doesn't look
political
good. So
party.
those will be, in fact, people are very eagerly waiting for their 2,500
Yeah.
rupees. Women are waiting. So that is not going to be rolled back. But on the other side, the revenues would need to be restructured, redesigned, so that there is a minimal impact on the fiscal health of Delhi.
Right. And now Aditya asks, with the decreasing revenue surplus over the years, if the new government continues with its welfare schemes along with new ones that it has promised in its manifesto, do you think Delhi is heading to a similar scenario of fiscal mismanagement that we saw in a state like Punjab?
So we are moving in that direction, though the magnitude is much smaller. But the fact that within 3 years, there has been a substantial deceleration of the revenue surplus from rupees 14,000 crore to rupees 3,000 crore, and then into a deficit. If this is the pace with which things are moving, then there is a possibility that we are moving towards a fiscal crisis, which needs to be avoided. So this is the time to start taking stock of the revenue position, expenditure position, the liability position, because again, the outstanding liabilities of Delhi are also not too high as of now.
Right.
So this is the right time to regroup all the three areas, relook the various fiscal metrics, so that we don't go the Punjab way, because that is disastrous. But at the same time, what is need to be done is some allocations have to be made towards capex, because that is something which needs attention, which has not got attention over the last couple of years, that needs attention. So some kind of balancing in revenue and capital expenditure without losing the path towards fiscal prudence would help Delhi.
Absolutely. And finally, Sankalp asks, do we have any study estimating the cost of the negative externalities affecting Delhi? I'm not exactly sure what he means by those, but most of BJP's manifesto promises are government obligations neglected for far too long in Delhi. Of course, welfare schemes are a cost, but how can one avoid it in a world with such cutthroat competitive politics? Budget controls and the strict mandate of the FRBM Act can only come through the Supreme Court, he says.
So that's true that there now the state has to, every state, that is true for every state, needs to have walk a fine balance between fiscal prudence as well as freebies, welfare schemes, and so on. And when we talk about negative externalities, we are not quite sure, because if we talk about negative externalities in terms of increasing the subsidy bill, which has actually ballooned quite a lot over the last couple of years of the AAP government. So that is something that will need to be restructured over the coming years. But that balance needs to be maintained. And if the government is able to maintain that balance and still stick to the path of fiscal prudence, there is no problem. But the politics and economics have to be balanced, and so that we don't move to a situation of a deeper fiscal crisis where we are falling into a situation of debt trap, where we are borrowing to repay our to at least to pay our interest payments. So that is where welfare will actually be the biggest casualty. So if any government is able to balance the political compulsions as well as fiscal discipline, then that's the right way to go.
Right, so there you go. I mean, it's actually a pretty clear picture. Delhi's revenue position is not looking too great. Its expenditure has ballooned over the last few years. And now the new BJP government is here, and they also have made several sizable promises in the run up to the elections in terms of freebies and subsidies. And it's going to have to come through on those as well. So things are not looking great for Delhi's finances. Revenue is not doing good. Expenditure is ballooning. Right now, debt is still small, but if this situation continues, then debt will also start becoming a big problem. So, this, in a nutshell, is the challenge before the BJP government: how to balance these conflicting streams, how to cater to all of the promises it's made, and also increase revenue at the same time. But on that note, that's all from us. Thank you for watching.